it's all about ego. It's a purely narcissistic pursuit. Do I think he wants the war to end? Yes, I do. But does he care about the details? Does he care about the nitty gritty and all of the things that are required for an actual just peace? No, he doesn't.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. A reminder, you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today, once again, is Michael Weiss, investigative journalist and editor of The Insider. Michael, thank you for coming back on the show. How are you today?
It's a pleasure. I'm doing okay. It's, what a year the last week has been, Fergus. It seems to be standard form under the current regime.
Absolutely. We often find that is the case here on the Trump Report. We really appreciate your time today because you have co-authored a piece in German publication Der Spiegel this week, which has made quite a splash. The piece revealed notes obtained from a call of European leaders that cast light on just how distrustful some are of the Trump administration in the wake of everything we've seen in the last week regarding sort of Steve Witkoff. Some of the standout quotes from the piece came from Finnish President Alexander Stubb, referring to Witkoff and Jared Kushner, saying we must not leave Ukraine and Volodymyr alone with these guys, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte seemed to agree. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz also said they are playing games with both you and us. What was your sort of reaction when you first came across this document?
I mean, there's nothing all that surprising in this transcript or in this phone call. These are the kind of sentiments that one would have expected the relevant parties to be holding, right? It's not a secret that the Europeans are quite concerned that the United States is about to do some kind of awful, dismal peace with Ukraine without really consulting Ukraine or basically just dictating terms to them. I mean, the surprise revelation that Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, had basically done an end run around not only the U.S. government and the interagency process that normally abides when there's some kind of negotiated peace with a foreign adversary such as Russia, but also in the Russian government. Dmitriev basically cut out the Russian foreign ministry, Sergei Lavrov. This whole thing was kind of cobbled together by a cadre of very hyper-caffeinated amateur civilians, right? People without any diplomatic experience. And it was written in by the Russians, by Dmitriev. I mean, we at the Insider reported that these 28 points, we had seen a draft of this 6 months ago in an inchoate form. Obviously, it was changed and revised somewhat, but the idea that this was Witkoff and Kushner's sort of grand design is nonsense. This was a Russian document that they had basically assimilated. And, in this document, the European Union was being told, not being asked, but being told, you will use the about $300 billion of frozen Russian assets. 50% of them would be kicked back to the United States. So if one were being uncharitable, one could read that as a bribe to Trump and his cronies. The European Union would also have to cough up $100 billion of its own money for reconstruction in Ukraine. Yeah, so that's one item where the Europeans completely had no buyer leave on any of this. The other, of course, was there would be no expansion of NATO. Not just that Ukraine couldn't join the alliance, but that no other country could. It would be frozen solid. NATO goes by consensus. Yeah, I mean, it's 28 countries get to vote on this stuff. But here again, the United States sort of unilaterally dictating in agreement with the Russians what the future of Europe was going to be like. So in essence, you had three people relitigating I would hazard not just 40 years of the American-led security architecture in Europe, but 80 years of the post-war American-led security architecture in Europe. And it was almost back of a cocktail napkin kind of carve up of Europe. The sort of things that conspiracy theorists love to think happens was actually happening. And yeah, I mean, it completely blindsided our allies in NATO. It completely blindsided the NATO Secretary General. The the French, the Germans, and it's also not surprising. We've seen this movie before. When Trump is sort of he's got this idea that we're going to just do a quick peace deal with the Russians. His instinct is to bludgeon Volodymyr Zelensky and sort of bring the Ukrainians to heel. He humiliates them publicly. He says that they're ungrateful. He reminds them that there, but for the largesse of the United States, they would be completely overrun by the Russian soldiers, even though at the present time, the United States pays no money whatsoever for Ukraine's defense. The Europeans are buying American weapons through this Pearl mechanism that was instituted in the summer. So it was kind of a repeat of what we've seen happen before, at least 3 or 4 times.
I'm sure you and
Yeah,
I have
the
had this
Europeans.
conversation before.
No, no. I mean, but in a way, it's gratifying as well because you see the Europeans say, "We will form a phalanx around our vulnerable ally, Ukraine. We mustn't let these dodgy real estate developers with grand designs come in and sort of humiliate and abase Zelensky." So, I mean, I took this to be this is good. This is a show of solidarity and simply self-preservation on the part of the Europeans. Now,
Well,
of course,
that point you make
yeah,
about self-preservation, is there a danger, do you think, do the Europeans fear at all that they kind of risk becoming a side character? When you're dealing with Donald Trump, if he wants to sort of push something through, he'll just ignore everyone else.
yeah. I've traveled a lot to Europe in the last 2 years, before Trump's election and then afterward. And the sentiments I get are as follows. One, well, the United States will always be with us. And we've dealt with Trump before in term one. We can navigate this crisis. It's all about finessing and managing his ego and his temperament. So let's not get too dramatic here. Number two, the United States is making noises like they want to leave NATO. J.D. Vance essentially intervened in the German election, trying to get AfD, in power. I mean, basically the Nazi power of Germany, which exercised not just Friedrich Merz, who he was trying to undermine, but basically the entirety of the German political establishment, with the possible exception of AfD. Right now, you have this U.S. national security document, which dropped last night, which states, and I could almost quote it verbatim for you if you like. One of the points, this has now become a U.S. national security priority. I just want to be clear. Cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. As never before in the United States has the United States seen Europe's current trajectory, which is to say, its political establishments across the board as enemy terrain that needs to be countermanded. And I don't know by what means it's going to be countermanded. Intelligence operations, covert action, influence campaigns. I mean, we've already begun to see that the United States is mucking about in Greenland in such a way, because of course, Donald Trump has his mind set on annexing Greenland, which would mean essentially going to war with Denmark, one of our most vital NATO allies. I mean, this is madness, right? And so, the Europeans usually say it's either, well, it's all noise and bluster and it's not really happening. And then they start to see that it is happening and they freak out. And the question I have to them is, what do you propose to do about this? I mean, perhaps it is time to begin to sort of extricate yourself or decouple from the United States, take security into your own hands, and say to the Americans, we're with you when our interests align, but when they do not, thank you very much, but excuse us. We are sovereign countries, and you don't dictate our fate to us. You certainly don't do it, in concert with the Russians behind our back.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because we're almost a year into Donald Trump's second presidency. And you're right, that idea that you said maybe some European leaders have had that we've dealt with him before. I mean, I think from my point of view, it became clear quite early on that Trump 2.0 is very different from Trump's first term.
It is. I mean, the first way in which it's different is the cliche in Trump term one was, well, there are adults in the room. McMaster, Mattis, John Bolton, people who are more seasoned and professional, who will essentially put a kind of straitjacket on this madman in the White House. And to some degree, that was true. The problem is Donald Trump eventually figured out that the adults in the room were doing this. He also felt that the adults in the room betrayed him, whether it was during his first impeachment, which, let us not forget, very much concerned Ukraine and sort of the politicking around Rudy Giuliani and his sort of grifting band of Russian intelligence assets. And then, of course, in his second impeachment over January 6th, an attempted insurrection in the United States, where the adults in the room, or just to say, just law-abiding, constitutionally minded Americans said, "Excuse me, Mr. President, but you can't do this." So he completely expunged, all of the, sort of people you would want to be in government from term two, and instead installed these lickspittles and cronies, many of whom do not have the CV and the experience to inhabit the roles that they've been given. Kash Patel, head of the FBI, for instance, Tulsi Gabbard, head of the DNI, and they just do his bidding for him. And his bidding can consist, as we've now seen in the last week, of basically war crimes, double taps on narco trafficking ships in the Caribbean with orders to kill everybody on sight. And if anybody should survive, hit them again. I mean, Pete Hegseth is our Secretary of Defense, or our Secretary of War, if you like, is very much in the hot seat and may actually lose his job because of this. But it goes to show how far you have to go to even be considered to be, on the chopping block in the Trump administration. War crimes caught on camera is kind of one of the metrics, I guess.
When you say do his bidding there, so on the topic of the war in Ukraine, is the end goal of the US, is it just simply just to end the war? It's like a bit of a nuisance.
So, Fergus, I mean, it's interesting. Everything I've just said, while still being true, is contradicted somewhat by the fact that institutionally, within the vast bureaucracies and agencies that make the U.S. government work, if you query people, sort of middle management, what's going on in Ukraine, you will get answers such as, well, to be honest, we're sharing lots of intelligence with the Ukrainians, including for the purposes of deep strikes, their launch of drones and their own homegrown cruise missiles targeting Russia's energy infrastructure, which is, I mean, really hobbled Russia's ability to make money with its main export. We are doing all kinds of interesting things with the Ukrainians inside Ukraine. CIA will say business is booming. It's even more robust than it had been under the Biden administration. Weapons still continue to make their way to Ukraine, both packages that were agreed to by the previous administration, and then I mentioned this Pearl mechanism, which is now in the billions of dollars, not quite to the degree, I mean, actually very far from the degree that it had been under Biden, which was basically donations of kit. But these things still can continue. And so, one of the lines I keep getting from people, in intelligence or national security is, this is all very confusing to us because we were given a set of instructions and we've been implementing a set of instructions which seem to be quite objectively pro-Ukraine. We've done damage to Russia under this administration. And yet here we, open Axios News or the Wall Street Journal and read, some kind of scummy little deal is being cooked up whereby the Ukrainians will be sold out. They'll have to forfeit, all of Donetsk to the Russians. And basically we're just setting the stage for yet another or prolonged war with Russia and calling that peace. So, again, there's an old saying in Russia that the Kremlin has many towers, which is to say, Putin or the Tsar, whilst being the final and decision maker, is still susceptible to influence and finagling by various factions and actors. I think the same thing applies to the United States. But I mean, this just begs the question of what we're dealing with here, right? The U.S. just should not be equivalent morally or politically to the Kremlin. And now I think we have to very much think of it in this way. It's sort of a soft authoritarian state that we're dealing with.
I guess my question is, where do you stand? Because we speak to a lot of contributors, and some of them do sort of say in our chats, they say, oh no, I do think that Donald Trump is serious about ending the war. He wants the war to end, but only so it's sort of, off his plate.
Off his plate, he gets a Nobel Peace Prize, and then he can just bang around on Truth Social for the rest of his days saying, I ended the largest land war in Europe since 1945. This is the 9th, 10th, 12th, conflict that I have single-handedly, put out the flames of. I mean, it's all about ego. It's a purely narcissistic pursuit. Do I think he wants the war to end? Yes, I do. But does he care about the details? Does he care about the nitty gritty and all of the things that are required for an actual just peace? No, he doesn't. He is still of the mind that Vladimir Putin is the best friend he just hasn't made yet. He doesn't quite understand that everything he's done, including and especially what he has just allowed to happen, empowering Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner, to go to Russia, sit down with Putin for 5 hours with really no kind of briefing book, with no plan of action, with no strategy. All that did, the headlines in the U.S. is fruitless talks. The Russians reject the peace. They're fruitless to the United States, to the Ukrainians, to the Europeans, but they're not fruitless to the Russians, because Putin sees this as desperation on the part of the Americans, specifically Trump. He sees this as just telegraphed weakness. I can do anything. I can keep them on the hook forever. I don't have to back down from my maximalist demands, perhaps inject a little nuance here or a signaling that I might be softening my position there. But by and large, they will come to me. They will regurgitate that which I and my emissaries have given to them and pretend like it's in their own words. And I'll just play this game forever whilst my troops advance, in the east of Ukraine. I mean, Putin still very much thinks he's going to win this war on military terms. Diplomatic terms, again, this exists, as a gift to him, to prolong the process, to allow his forces to regenerate, to allow his economy to try and, would the Russians love to see sanctions lifted? Of course. Realistically, do they expect to see them lifted? I don't think they do. And they have made contingency plans for exactly this state of affairs. So, Trump is desperate to have this happen. The problem is he is advertising his desperation, which makes it the prospect of it happening much more remote.
Talk about sanctions being lifted, because this same week, only 2 days after that meeting, the Treasury Department partially suspended sanctions against the Russian oil giant Lukoil petrol stations outside of Russia. I mean, it was only sort of in the back end of November that these came into effect, and a few weeks later they're sort of scaled back. And I guess that sort of all came from. It's not a coincidence that happened in the same week they had the meeting.
Right. I mean, and again, you've got actors within the administration, Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who seems to be singing from the right hymn sheet. He was the guy pushing for sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which nobody expected to happen. I certainly was taken.
Yeah,
by
I remember
surprise.
It was a big story.
It was a big story, and it had an immediate effect, right? Even before the enforcement mechanism kicks in, which was not some kind of conspiracy. This is just how Treasury works. They give a 30-day wind down period to allow companies to extricate themselves from possibly being in violation of the law and thus being sanctioned. But the pariah effect is instantaneous, because nobody wants to be cut out of the US dollar market. So they all were scrambling. You had a lot of companies throughout Europe and in the Middle East selling off their Lukoil assets. There was this attempt by the Russians to do some kind of shady deal with Gunvor, a Swiss commodities trader, which the U.S. government previously had identified as Vladimir Putin's personal piggy bank, that he has direct access to cash in Gunvor's coffers. An attempt to do that was blocked by Treasury. So we were headed in a fairly good direction here. And then, as you say, there's this new process in place. And the process is, oh, no, we're making peace with the Russians. Let's not rock the boat. Let's put a pause on anything that could be seen as untoward or provocative. And by the way, it's not just about sanctions. One of the other things that was being working its way through the system, both at the Department of Defense level and at the DNI level, was litigation of the intelligence community's attempt to investigate the origins of anomalous health incidents, otherwise known as Havana syndrome. And quite a lot of people, including victims of this syndrome, were of the mind that they might actually get some measure of justice. That, in other words, even though it's being motivated by bad faith, Tulsi Gabbard wanting to bash the deep state, in this instance, there was a bit of a cover up. There was, a lack of forensic, due diligence when it comes to investigating attacks on American personnel, particularly intelligence officers abroad, using what has been suggested are directed energy weapons. So there was this idea that, actually, ironically, Donald Trump might be the guy to get to the bottom of a really malign Russian campaign to harm Americans. And then it came screeching to a halt as well. Nothing is going to come out. There's not going to be a statement. There's not going to be any kind of,
And that's all happened this week as well.
That's all happened on the backs of this 28-point, peace agreement or whatever.
Just quickly, before I let you go, the piece that you wrote also had a quote from Emmanuel Macron, where it said, there's a chance the US will betray Ukraine on territory without clarity on security guarantees. Now, it's worth saying that Paris has denied that he used those words. But when we say territory, we're talking about the Donbass there, are we?
Yeah. Yeah. So, Witkoff and Kushner, again, they're real estate developers. So they see war. They see a war of conquest in Europe in terms of property management. Okay, well, let's talk square footage here. Like $300 a square foot. It's all transactional. It's all sort of fungible for them. And they're like, well, the Russians want this little strip of land here. Why don't you just give it to them, and then we have a deal? What they don't take into account is neither one of them have been to Donetsk. This is a strip of citadels. This is one of the most fortified places on the planet. So created over the last 10 years since Russia's first invasion to forestall exactly this prospect of the Russians taking it over. Because if they were to take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, that puts them within striking distance of other territories. And now we're getting into the strategic heart of Ukraine again. And I think you'd really be straining credulity. You'd really have to want to be so naive as to think that if the Russians were able to do that, again, either by stroke of a pen or by military means, that they would simply stop there. Every Ukrainian you talk to would say, no, Putin is in it to win it. He wants all of Ukraine. And if he has to take it through political measures, bribery, the use of corruption, which Ukraine does not lack, if we've seen in the last 2 weeks, intelligence operations, hybrid warfare, drone attacks, and getting into more of a kind of mixed way of doing business in Ukraine, which the Russians had done prior to 2014. He wants the whole thing. And I think the Europeans are very savvy to this. They're under no illusions, but Donald Trump is under only illusions, it seems. And certainly the people, his plenipotentiaries, he's enabled to do this deal for him. They're not fit for purpose, Fergus. They don't know what they're talking about. And that's the danger. Putin is not a great grand master strategist. Let's not pump him up too much. And he's made many miscalculations and many mistakes, including invading a country like Ukraine, which he thought, because he was told by his corrupt intelligence officers, this was going to be a cakewalk. 3 days, Kyiv, 2 weeks, we're at the border with Poland. However, he is a seasoned KGB case officer. He likes to do games of psychological manipulation. And you'll notice, on the back of Witkoff and Kushner's little happy visit to Moscow, he's gone to India, and the Indian media are asking him, so how'd it go? And he's basically shrugging his shoulders, almost acting as if he could have done without it. And he said, well, it's 5 hours. I kind of lost track. I got bored. mean, can you imagine? He's the one who put them there for 5 hours, and he's saying, I lost interest in my own peace accord. I mean, this is trolling of the highest magnitude. But again, a guy like Witkoff, I call Witkoff Dim Philby for a reason. I mean, he is an agent of influence. He doesn't realize it, though. He's not got the nous to understand he's being so played and manipulated and humiliated. He'll come back for more. And Kushner, I mean, Kushner looks terrified to be alive these days. I don't know what he's doing here. I can only reckon that he thinks that this is going to be Gaza 2.0. It's like WhatsApping with MBS. He can do that with Kirill Dmitriev or Yuri Ushakov, and suddenly there's going to be peace in our time with the Russians. I hate to break it to you, but Europe is not the Middle East. Eurasia is not the Middle East either. The Kremlin is not like dealing with Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Turk.
Just the final point before I let you go on that. Witkoff and Kushner were expected to meet with the top Ukrainian negotiator last night in Miami. Do you think that is what the Ukrainian side will be saying to them as kind of their sort of leverage in this?
The Ukrainian side, this is the real problem in this dynamic. The Ukrainians can't put a foot wrong. We see what happens when they speak up and defend themselves a little too forcefully. It was the February Oval Office, 2 minutes of hate delivered by J.D. Vance principally, but then also by Donald Trump against Volodymyr Zelensky. So the Ukrainians have played this game where it's just a pure kind of, and it's hard to watch sometimes. I mean, they're just pure courtiers. They have to polish the throne. They have to lavish praise on Donald Trump. Yes, sir. You're right, sir. We're so happy you're doing this for us. We know that you're interested in peace. We've come to the table. You want an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. You've got it. Whereas the Russians can just kind of bat around Donald Trump like a kitten with a ball of yarn, and they never seem to come in for the same treatment. They are the enemy. They are the adversary, and we're acting as though they're our ally. What can we do for you? It's just like a car salesman. What can we do to put you in this, Mustang convertible today? This is just, it's completely distorted. It's contradictory statecraft. And I think, by the way, the person I haven't mentioned in this conversation, but it's kind of important, Marco Rubio, who, Rubio is a fascinating case study for me. He's the kind of guy that the philosopher Leo Strauss would have written about, talking about, 14th century Asiatic potentates and how to, sort of write hidden texts in your essays about totalitarianism or autocracy. I mean, this is a guy who goes up on telly and talks the party line to the degree that he literally puts Donald Trump to sleep. This president has it, and Donald Trump is just kind of nodding off in the background. He can't be bothered. He can't hear it, like Putin with Witkoff. And yet, if you listen carefully, and if you know sort of Rubio's backstory, I mean, he's an internationalist Republican. He's an Atlanticist. No one's under any illusions about that. He was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's been to Europe innumerable times. He's a hawk on Russia.
And they used to be adversaries as well, didn't they?
They hated each other. Yeah, he was little Marco. I mean, literally, Marco Rubio was making jokes about the size of Donald Trump's penis in the primaries in 2016. And now, he's not only Secretary of State, he's not only National Security Advisor. I think he's the head of the National Archive. He's got like 18 different jobs in this administration. But I will say this. He has managed to kind of walk this knife edge of trying to kind of keep this circus together and also put out the various fires that are set by, among other people, J.D. Vance. So it's important to see what's happening now as a kind of a rivalry between two people who are vying for the mantle of heir apparent. This is about succession to Donald Trump. Vance v. Rubio. Vance is an isolationist. Vance is very much egging Witkoff and Kushner on. Go make whatever deal with the Russians. Just get it over with. Let's have our ticker tape parade. Let's declare mission accomplished, victory, and J.D. Vance will get all the credit and glory. That's why the Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, was sent to Kyiv to deliver this 28-point plan. Dan Driscoll has no business doing diplomacy. He'll be the first to tell you, by the way. He's a guy who's interested in military innovation and drones. He was empowered to do this by J.D. Vance. Marco Rubio has tried to sabotage this dismal deal at every step along the way. He rings up his friends from the Senate whilst they're at the Halifax Security Forum just last week or a week and a half ago. Don't worry about this. This isn't codified policy. This is a Russian wish list. We're going to whittle it down. And they said he did this. Then, of course, he tweets out he didn't do it. He's denied it, but he did do it, right? I mean, again, it's this sort of talking out of both sides of your mouth, and I think he's trying to appease the Europeans, reassure, I should say, the Europeans. And I'll say this: I have the full transcript of this phone call. Rubio is not mentioned once. Yeah, it's just Witkoff. It's just Kushner. Those are the people that the Europeans are worried about. So where is the Secretary of State, who you would assume would be running point on this? He's been marginalized, and I think his calculation is, okay, I've got this 28-point thing down to 19 points that the Ukrainians can say yes to. I know the Russians well enough that Putin is just going to humiliate everybody. He's going to reject this out of hand. And then the important thing is, who's holding the bag at the end of this? It ain't going to be me, because I wasn't part of it. It'll be Witkoff. Kushner is bulletproof because he's the son-in-law of the president, but Witkoff not necessarily is. J.D. Vance, however, he's the one who should own this as a colossal failure. Abject humiliation of the United States, waste of time, big embarrassment. It's JD's fault, not mine. I think that's the game that's being played. And I say that with a little bit of, informed reporting behind it, because there are people who are whispering about what's actually happening. As I say, the Kremlin has many towers. The White House has many towers as well.
Well, we very much appreciate your informed reporting here on the Trump Report. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael Weiss.
Sure. Anytime, Fergus.